audience, captured audience, audio. I'm gonna share something with you in this wise. In a book, Frederick Douglass, The Prophet of Freedom, possibly in the tradition of the African American who were enslaved in the Americas. Sometimes there can be a hard pill to swallow. And how do we, make the transition? The biggest stage in the captured audience. Stephen Bantu Pico said you can never achieve the aspirations of the oppressed from the oppressor's platform. That which is oppressing people is ignorance. In this monolithic structure here. But Islam say that this whole universe is a masjid. This, and I'm not connecting what I'm getting ready to say with that, but I want to say that the biggest stage is is life, on the stage of life, this universe. Not the biggest stage at the Capitol, the monument. No. The biggest stage is life of this universe. And people just built on this stage and they control it and determine that this is the biggest stage because I built it. From the book. Just an excerpt from it. I just want to just trying to be clear, trying to make a transition as much as I can. It says here in the book, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, by David W. Blight. Throughout the spring morning of April 14, 1876, a huge crowd, largely African American, began to assemble. And remember that the African American culture, institutions, is birthed. First, we must deal with the trauma and the capture and being captured. It's I can't recall one more off the top of my head, and that comes out gave birth to the African American culture. Yes. Um, it began at 17th K Streets in Northwest Washington D.C. It had been 11 April since the end of the Civil War, and in years two today the uh, since the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Parade involving nearly every African American organization in the city was about to step off at noon en route to the unveiling of an extraordinary monument to Lincoln. The city had witnessed many remarkable parades since the end of the war, but this one would be different. The day was declared a public holiday in Washington, and flags above the Capitol as well as other government buildings flew at half mast. At the head of the procession rode a contingent of 27 mounted police, followed by three companies of black militia troops headed by a Philharmonic Band of Georgetown, numerous other cornet bands, marching drum crops, youth clubs in colorful uniforms, and fraternal orders from both Washington and Baltimore filled in long line with pride and pomp. The Knights of St. Augustine carried a large banner with a painting of the martyred Lincoln. Horse-drawn carriages carried, among others, the black Virginian freeborn professor and dean of Howard University Law School, John Mercer Langston, who would perform a master of ceremonies and the orator of the day, a newly arrived resident of Washington, who famed abolitionist and editor Frederick Douglass, who had grown up as a slave across Chesapeake Bay on the eastern shore of Maryland. Langston and Douglass were soon to become open political and personal rivals, but on this day they joined in one of the most important public events of their lives. The procession moved westward along K Street to 17th Street, then south a few blocks through the grounds of the Executive Mansion, the White House, which in those days was not walled off by security, and to Pennsylvania Avenue. The parade traveled eastward directly toward the Capitol, turning briefly right on First West, then around the South Capitol ground, the First East, and finally on the East Capitol side, East Capitol Street for 11 more blocks. The bands, marches, and carriages passed throngs of people until they reached 11th Street at the edge of the field, an emerging residential square. The setting was much better than on the Washington Mall, which at that time was swampy and unhealthy, used in places as dump. A festive crowd awaited the parade, and a tall statue stood draped, concealed in flags and bunting. Next to the monument, a stage, a large speaker stands awaiting a distinguished array of guests. President Ulysses S. Grant, now nearing the end of his second term and final term in the office, and arrived before the parade reached the park. It was accompanied by many U.S. senators, including Oliver P. Morton, George Bowell, John Sherman, and Blanche K. Bruce, members of the President's Cabinet, the Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, many members of the House of Representatives, and a large contingent of other government officials, as well as former Union generals. Near the platform, the Marine band struck up Hail Columbia as the speakers walked from their carriages, and hundreds of marchers found their places in the vast audience. It says Hail Columbia. Did not say Hail Humanity. Hail Columbia. As the ceremony began, Bishop John M. Brown of the AME Church delivered an invocation. Sounds familiar to this day, but we proceed on. And John Henry Birch of Louisiana read the Emancipation Proclamation. At the conclusion of the reading, the band played La Marseillaise. Langston introduced James E. Yetman at St. Louis banker, the head of the Western Sanitary Commission, the organization that had led the fundraising among the former slaves and the black Civil War veterans of Missouri and elsewhere in the country, who provided nearly 20,000 that paid for the monument. Yetman explained how the former slave woman Charlotte Scott had donated the first five, and how the commission had sought the American sculptor Thomas Ball, who resided in Italy, to conceive and create the statue. The Freedmen's Memorial Emancipation Statue. The kneeling slave represented as perfectly passive freedom to the emancipated slave as agent in his own deliverance. Freedom Siege, Yetman concluded that the monument was an ideal group converted into the literal truth of history. Well, it says that African Americans had uh, tenuously arrived and finally openly in the center of the country's highest affairs. Douglass made it clear that the unveiling of this monument to Lincoln and emancipation was it a unveiling of one's humanity for the development of one's intellect for the betterment of humanity, or have one comes to term distinctively came to terms with his or her humanity was a national act performed by citizens of the city is also associated with being civil or civilization, complete civility, or is this is showing the degree which one has came to in his or her civility, and one has led the band, the call, marching, the parade, and one has became a part of a people who have understand that this is, their civility, their humanity, in which people have, you know, become a part of and wanting to be a part of. Was it an emancipation for both um, groups of people, and was it a emancipation for the nation? Was it emancipation to display the degree of one's humanity, and maybe it was a degree of each other's humanity as one tried to continue to learn how to coexist one with another? Douglas went on, I believe, and says every pulsation of the national heart can be heard, felt. I'm just going on with the book, I should say, and and reciprocated. Yes, Douglas. He insisted on an initial history lesson, referring to the vast, wonderful change in our condition. Frederick Douglass really had a way of his experiences that he has shared in converting those experiences into a teaching moment. For example, is a time when his Aunt Esther was being taken advantage of, and he realized that his relationship with his slave master was one of sexual immorality. Now, but this Aunt Esther, let us transition from that until the date, because we have to build on, make this transition and build on the tradition. Is that um, if the as Aunt Esther wanted to have a relationship with whom she wanted to, and not being forced in a relationship with another individual, and then when she gets the opportunity to have a relationship with whom she wants, then that could breed not only resentment but can breed a act of promiscuity. Yes, can breed an act of promiscuity because he says, I was prevented from doing something. Now that I'm able to do it, I can do, whenever I want and what I want. Yes. So we look at the activity that is taking place in modern times. So the vast majority of change in our condition, black freedom and citizenship, Let's look at this black freedom and citizenship. It was something that was written by a brother, and he said that it's about advancing the process of freedom. Freedom is for the human intellect and the rational potential. You cannot enslave a man's will and potential. This is associated with Imam Muhammad, and he was speaking about the Quran's mission. Now, I'm not promoting any religious ideology or doctrine or philosophy or whatever. The only thing I promote is the value of self-worth. He talks about the higher ideal of freedom is not freedom from physical bondage, physical restrictions, but freedom of the human intellect, of the rational potential that God gave equally to all people. You cannot slave a man's will or potential. You may capture or hold him back physically, but if he remains in the order God created him and does not sacrifice the spirit forward movement God put him in, he will remain free, though he may be physically confined. You know how some people may be in the prisons, but at the same time, they developing their intellect and they becoming free. But the challenge is uh, the sincerity of it, because once the hedge of protection is taken from them by being in there and they are released, then we will see due to outside influences. What I was saying earlier about the institutions of the beginnings of the African American culture or societies and culture, I was dealing with the before any aggregated plantation slaves could begin to create viable institutions, they would have to deal with the traumatic or the traumata or trauma of capture, enslavement, and transport. Hence the beginnings of what would later develop into African American culture. Culture is the totality of people, thought, and practice in the society in which we live. Some will call it culture hegemony. This is the humanity that I'm giving to the world. So, this free black citizenship, as Frederick Douglass was speaking about in the book, no such open commemoration by blacks in Washington would have been tolerated before the Civil War. Commemoration by blacks in Washington. Remember, I'm talking about the audience, the biggest stage that one could be on, the platform. Remember, I said earlier, Stephen Bantu Biko said you can't achieve the aspirations of the oppressor's platform, and some will argue that you can. Now, this is the tradition of the African American, the African who has been enslaved, and in the strategy thereof, in accepting the fact that that he or she who has in control the platform, and in determining this is the highest stage, and then therefore we gravitate to it. But no one talks about Gloria Richardson in the civil rights movement, where she refused a voice to speak on the March of Washington in the 1960s. Even the late um, brother John Lewis, he had to change his speech. You know, so it's strategy, and not to mention there probably were others who were unable to speak because someone is controlling the platform. And I'm not discarding the Million Man March. There are probably others who had something to share, but and on at that particular platform. And then there was one in the Bible where it talks about a guy named John the Baptist. Make way. You know, um, here's one that is coming, and he didn't hog the platform. All he was doing is pointing the way. That's all we can do. And the platform should be used to bring awareness, but it's to point the way of that which is coming. That which is coming. And that which is coming back to one's humanity. But we must be clear is that we do not let anyone use the skill and the talent and one's ability, and then they use the resources to support the matter and their agenda, I should say, in controlling and the in programming the masses of the people to serve their best interests, the interests of those behind the scenes calling the shots. Yes. So, no such open commemoration by blacks in Washington would ever tolerate tolerance, because we're talking about tolerance now. Because I always say that society is under a social reconstruction where our feelings are becoming desensitized, our thoughts demoralized, our attitude dehumanized, our activity destabilized, and our, our communication devitalized, and yes, our society is under a social reconstruction. Our feelings are becoming desensitized, our thoughts demoralized, our attitude dehumanized, our communication devitalized. Yes, it means what we saying to one another, we're really not listening. Yes. So, and then as a result, our activity becomes destabilized. So, dealing with a spirit of apathy. But universal tolerance. One's how much can you withstand? Because remember, if there is a process called a maturation process of understanding, then tolerance. When you understand, then you understand what can you tolerate and that which you will not tolerate. One's capacity to readdress social diversity, moving from a persecuted minority and privileged majority. And it is designed to address one's aspirations, because when inspiration comes down, one's aspiration goes up. And this is also taken associated with 1954 Supreme Court Brown versus Board of Education, was that the students didn't have adequate tools to work with. Yes, and also it is a associated with, I think even W. Du Bois talks about, he didn't go to these schools of higher learning or prestigious schools due to their because they were the prestige, but the environment was conducive for their learning. So this commemoration of blacks has never been tolerated before since the Civil War. Transformations, opening floodgates of wrath and violence. Douglas congratulated all white and black, famous and ordinary, on this contrast between then and now. The orator conditioned his audience for the harder truths and starker metaphors to come by letting them feel the long and dark history of slavery as a matter of the past, replaced now by liberty, progress, and enlightenment. No African American speaker ever faced this kind of captive audience composed of the leadership of the federal government in one place, and no such speaker would ever again until Barack Obama was inaugurated. So we look at this audience of today, of that particular stage, and we look at the inauguration of young people and people who are able to express themselves, or a young lady who's able to express his or herself. And in that inclusion, in the sophistication, in the tradition and sophistication of those who create this platform, in the biggest platform of the society, and capturing the audience, huh? The worldwide audience of people, and pointing to what is to come, what is coming. Yet there is a disconnect and a exclusion of others to be able to relate and identify with that, because the biggest platform and that we have is the platform of this universe, this platform of life in which we live. It's not built by hands. It is a natural platform that needs attention, and that attention is to be good stewards of it, not the attention of others, not the human attention, the human extravaganza, the human self-aggrandizement, the human notoriety, but this to be good stewards of this universe and to be good steward of the use of our faculties for the betterment of humanity. Until the next time, you make the call. You make sense out of it. Talk to you.